Happy President's Day. Welcome back to our RFL special. President Trump and his America First agenda has ushered in a new era of nationalism. The immigration crackdowns, protectionist trade policies, distancing the U.S. from NATO and the United Nations, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. Those just some of his policies. Not the first time we've seen things like this, especially when it comes to clamping down on immigration. America is, of course, a land of immigrants, but they haven't always been welcomed. First attempt to limit immigration happened in the late 1880s with the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's actually what the act was called. It limited the number of immigrants as Americans were concerned that they were taking jobs, especially jobs of people building the railroads. In the 1920s, Congress passed a law capping overall immigration for the first time. The number of Germans was also limited. People were worried about hordes of poor people fleeing a war-torn Europe and coming here for refuge. Some hardliners in Congress even wanted a total immigration ban. After the stock market crash in 1929, that ushered in the Great Depression and caused even more hysteria. President Hoover put further caps on immigration, and now we have a president who wants to build a wall across our entire southern border, limit immigration for family members of people already here, and ban it outright from a slew of Muslim countries. And David, let me start with you on this. Nationalism, is there a tidy way to define what nationalism is, or is it one of those things where you know it when you see it?
I think you kind of know it when you see it. I would say it's more what we call nativism, this idea that we don't want foreigners coming in, we don't want immigrants coming into the country. And you're right, we've seen this in the past. Probably the one era that's the most reminiscent of this is the 1920s, when you had large numbers of Russian Jews coming into the country, southeastern Europe, many Catholics from Italy, Sicily, and so forth. And you had a resurgence of the KKK, of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. That was, they continued to discriminate against blacks, but they also were very focused on Jewish and Catholic immigration. They were very anti-Catholic, very anti-Jewish. So that ugly environment helped precipitate the 1924 National Origins Act, which greatly restricted American immigration. They tried to roll the clock back to prior to 1890, when all these Jews and Catholics had entered the country. And in a sense, looking for more Northern Europeans. Trump mentioned Norway. Well, we're talking about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population being favored over Catholic and Jewish population. So we've definitely seen this in the past, and it's eerily reminiscent.
And Dwayne, while we are seeing this anti-immigrant push coming from the White House, we're also seeing a lot of resistance from people who are coming to the aid of these immigrant groups, whether it's the immigrant communities themselves or people simply defending them. Is that also a parallel through our history? Have we seen that in times of anti-immigration pushes in the past?
Yeah, certainly there were people like Herbert Lehman, senator from New York in the 1950s. In 1952, Congress passed the McCarran-Walter Immigration and Naturalization Act, which pretty much kept intact the limits, the quotas that had been imposed in the 1920s. And Lehman, was in the forefront of those, trying to get those quotas lifted, to raise the total number of immigrants, but particularly to do away with the discriminatory quotas, which limited the number of immigrants from Italy, limited the number of immigrants from Portugal and Greece, and allowed large numbers of immigrants from Norway, Sweden, places where there were very few people coming to the United States from. And it wasn't until 1965, as part of his Great Society, that Lyndon Johnson was able to persuade Congress to change the immigration laws and do away with those quotas and impose other categories, priorities for immigrants coming to this country.
It's amazing how often it seems our history is something of a pendulum. It swings one way, it swings back. Absolutely. And we see the echoes of policies from the past repeated in the present, and I'm sure we will see it again. But that begs the question, David, what prompts that pendulum to swing the other way, or at least what has prompted it in times past? You mentioned the 20s, we went back to the Chinese immigration in the 1880s. What eventually caused that pendulum to shift back?
Well, I mean, certainly in the case of 1930s and the Second World War, you had the perpetration of the Holocaust, which of course was a devastating event in world history, a kind of singular event, a mass murder of the Jews in the Second World War. In the 1930s, Roosevelt himself was very much hemmed in by the National Origins Act, by Congress. One of the things I think we're learning and have learned in the last couple of decades is just how restricted the president's movement is on some of these issues vis-a-vis Congress. again, this is part of the reason we're seeing more executive orders. Roosevelt did, by the way, change the status of refugees from the bottom of the list to the top in 1935, which is why virtually all the immigrants that came in from Germany and Austria from 1935 forward were Jews, because prior to that they were considered refugees, and therefore they were discarded as refugees or as immigrants.
It can take an awfully long time for that pendulum to swing back. I mean, certainly right after World War II, there's a lot of unhappiness with the strict immigration quotas. There are hundreds of thousands of displaced persons in camps in Europe. And finally, in 1948, I think it was, a special bill was passed by Congress allowing some of these DPs to enter the United States. But that was done rather than changing the basic structure of the law. And it's not until 1965 that the law is finally changed.
You do have these exceptions, you know, the Vietnamese immigration, which was hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country, and other countries as well, as a kind of humanitarian gesture. So you have the opposite. You have the cases in history where there is a kind of humanitarian opening towards immigrants. But you know, sadly, all too often you have the opposite, where you know we see the shutting down. And I think we're in one of those periods now where President Trump is playing to people's fears, and part of the reason he was elected. And you know, stoking those fears makes people more and more suspicious of allowing people into the country, much like we saw in the 1930s.
That prompts another question. We're almost out of time, and I want to get to it. What populism? I hear that term, and some people have used it interchangeably with nationalism. They're different. What's the difference between nationalism and populism?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, a popular leader, a populist figure who has a kind of charisma, has a kind of popular appeal, you know, it depends on how you pursue that. I would argue that Franklin Roosevelt pursued a type of populism that was based on banishing fear, on hope, and on a positive agenda, whereas President Trump has pushed, you know, used fear as a means to gain support in quite the opposite way. So there are different types of populism.
Right. I mean, if we think back further in American history, William Jennings Bryan, the populist movement in the 1890s was based on fear of the New York bankers, the Jews, and other outsiders, or people who were perceived as outsiders. So it does have, even in American history, populism can have a negative connotation here too.
We'll take our next break. When we come back, anybody who's ever seen Schoolhouse Rocks knows that we have three branches of government that are supposed to be separate but equal. It's possible President Trump missed that episode because it looks like he's trying to rewrite the rule book. We'll get into that next.